Welcome, everyone. I'm very happy to introduce Stephen for his fourth and final talk, and without further ado, here he is.
Good evening, everybody. Thanks for coming. For those of you who have been coming time after time, thank you for returning for this fourth in the series on the quest, science, religion, and the quest for a new narrative. We have taken the first three evenings in discussing the crisis, the spiritual crisis of the present day, and tracing its roots back to what were thought to be fundamentally irreconcilable and contradictory ways of looking at the world, which we abbreviated by Athens and Jerusalem. We talked about the tradition of Athens and the tradition of Jerusalem representing two ways of imagining how the world works, which have historically been at odds with each other. At times, historically, also have found brief unions, such as during the scholasticism of the Middle Ages. At other times, such as the days that we live in, the centuries actually that we live in since really the time of the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, these two have been farther apart than ever. These two ways of looking at the world, in very brief terms, being perhaps too briefly summarized as looking at the world as something which is revealed to us, versus looking at the world as something which we ourselves unlock the secrets of through the use of our own intellect, through the use of reason. We're looking here at the roots of the conflict between faith and reason. A faith position, we'll say, being ultimately one that holds that our deepest understandings of things come not through our own efforts, but through their being revealed to us by a succession of great figures, the leaders, the founders of the great world religions, who innately had a insight, understanding of reality that others don't have. This way of looking at the world and the consequences that follow have historically been in tension with what we call the tradition of Athens, in which we look at the world as something which yields to our exertions, the laws of which can be penetrated by the human mind. As with all dichotomies, this dichotomy has its limitations, can be attacked, can certainly be justifiably questioned, but nevertheless, it can be a helpful way of thinking about where we're at. And it's precisely to try to subvert this dichotomy and to suggest that the dichotomy is, in the end, an illusory dichotomy, has been the overall purpose of this series of talks. So where has it led us so far? It's led us, first of all, to this, as I mentioned, what I'm calling the spiritual crisis of the modern age, a sense which now, not exactly so recent, but many generations now, even centuries, at least as far as Western Europe is concerned, a sense of the loss of the sacred, a sense that there was a dimension of the spirit which was accessible to us, which we could which was an anchor for us, something in which we had absolute certainty, that there was a spiritual world, ultimately in contradistinction to the physical world. This spiritual world is something which successive generations of scientific investigation have gradually pushed farther and farther into the background. It used to be that the spiritual world began where the tides and the storms on the sea began. The spiritual world began when lightning and thunder were unleashed from the sky. To primitive man, certain actions of nature were considered to be the direct interposition of the gods in the world. And it wasn't until further advance of our knowledge of meteorology, of the processes of the movement of the crusts of the earth. Now we understand earthquakes. It wasn't until our advancing scientific knowledge was able to encompass these set of phenomena that were previously thought of as spiritual phenomena, as the results of the actions of divine beings from outside. As the sphere of our knowledge increased, so did the sphere of possible action of that kind gradually shrink. This God of the gaps was gradually pushed out of existence until today it remains only in a few small areas. I'll call them small. These are still big areas. The question of how did life emerge? The question of what is consciousness? The question, how did the universe begin? So there's still a few major questions of some significance that have yet to be convincingly answered by this equation or that, or by the onward march of science. And into these gaps, there are still those who would like to project the direct interposition of the divine and say, well, we don't understand how life started because it required a divine intervention. And so there are those, for instance, in the camp, not academic evolutionary biologists, but those who follow something called intelligent design, who try to argue that the complexity of life, even at the simplest scales, is such as to preclude its having come into existence by accident. There are still those who really want to insert the God of the gaps into the equation. They want to find at the end some cause which comes from outside the causal framework. It's this God of the gaps which has been so sort of squeezed out of existence and replaced by our scientific understanding, that for many there's a feeling that those spiritual pillars that we had based ourselves on have well nigh disappeared. That there's a spiritual crisis because there's no longer a sense. There's a sense now that science can explain everything we need to know about the world. And if science can explain everything that we need to know, then what reason remains for positing the existence of a spiritual dimension of things? William of Ockham, one of the great medieval thinkers, and his famous razor, the principle that one should not multiply unnecessarily the number of hypotheses one needs to explain a given set of phenomena. By Occam's razor, some would argue we can simply do away with the existence of a spiritual world. So there's this long debate between Athens and Jerusalem. In the modern age, it seems as though science is one, but there's a lingering sense, let's call it more than a lingering sense. There are great movements afoot in the world today that thoroughly reject that conclusion of science. We're looking at extremist movements, fundamentalist movements, both in East and in West, which collectively have millions of people behind them, which collectively can still pose a great threat to the stability of civilization. What is the solution to that? Is it a long-term solution of gradually those ideas will disappear in the course of time as succeeding generations of people are better educated, have a more realistic sense of what's right and what's wrong? Are we talking a time scale of centuries before these sorts of extreme views ultimately recede from the stage? Or is there something else afoot? Is there a set of ideas? Is there a new way of understanding things which can significantly cut that time scale down? Is there a new religion or a new way of looking at the phenomenon of religion in the world today? Maybe what you might even call a meta-religion, a way of looking at the entire religious experience of the human race, which promises in a much shorter time frame to ease some of these great ills that afflict civilization. We look to science, though, first of all, for insights into how to move forward. We look to the metaphysical humility of the scientific enterprise. We talked a couple of sessions ago about, and we spent at some length talking about theories of gravity, and how the first theory of gravity was very simple. The Earth was flat. You drop something, it falls. This theory actually works pretty well, as long as you don't realize, as long as you're not sailing ships, to the other side of the Earth. A flat Earth hypothesis is actually quite an accurate theory for the world around us. This way of looking at the universe replaced by something vastly more adequate and accurate, an actual theory of gravity, an actual map of the cosmos in which the Earth is not flat, but it's a sphere and it orbits around the sun rather than the other way around, because the sun is more massive and the less massive things orbit around the more massive things. This theory of gravity, discovered by Isaac Newton, in very simple mathematical terms, produces such an astonishingly precise set of predictions, that so precise that one could build satellites and send them to land on other planets and orbit distant planetary systems. Astonishingly precise, but yet, as precise as the Newtonian system was, it wasn't realized until a couple hundred years later that the metaphysical basis of it was entirely wrong. The metaphysical basis of the Newtonian system is space and time being absolute and distinct from each other. In Einstein's theory of gravity, which replaced Newton's theory, space and time are, as everyone knows, more of a fabric. They translate into each other depending on your perspective, depending on your velocity relative to another observer. And this subtle distinction between space and time being a manifold, a higher dimensional manifold, versus space and time being absolute. The difference between those two is the difference between two completely different ways of imagining what are the metaphysical ultimate realities. But the strange thing is, although Newtonian physics was almost entirely wrong in terms of its assumption about the nature of space and time, it's almost entirely correct in the predictions it makes. And one comes away with this with, I think, a profound sense, not just of the amazing power of science, but also the amazing ability of approximations to get you somewhere, even though they may be based on the wrong assumptions. If we could take this, and by the way, we know that Einstein's framework is itself only an approximation of some further theory, which has yet to be discovered. Some people think it's string theory. There are others working on other theories. That final theory has yet to be discovered, but when it does, it's going to displace Einstein's theory of gravity. It may be in the end that the fundamental constituents of the universe are not point particles, electrons and quarks, but maybe they are higher dimensional objects, strings, loops, maybe even sheets, planes, maybe even 26-dimensional objects. All of these are possible. All of these represent completely different metaphysics. But could we take from this something and a deeper understanding of how we have understood religious realities throughout the ages? Could it be that different religions in a similar way represent successive approximations of a reality which is ultimately unknown? We don't know the ultimate substance of things. We can't describe the ultimate causes or agencies of things. We can't even describe that reality although many have tried, which lies within us, that which we have called the human soul or spirit. We can't prove that it exists or doesn't, although many have tried. We can't prove that there's life after death. All of these metaphysical uncertainties, is it our ultimate fate that these things remain uncertain? Is it possible that we'll ever capture in an absolute sense what the realities of these things are? If we take a leaf from the book of science, we might end up with more of a posture of humility about these ultimate realities, God and the soul, an understanding that everything we can understand, everything that we can perceive, represents only successive approximations. Perhaps this might be what Baha'u'llah referred to in the Gleanings when he said, and I paraphrase, that coming to an understanding of one's helplessness in the face of that reality which lies within, then how much more do we acknowledge our helplessness to understand that reality that lies without, that ultimate creator that many have called God. And Baha'u'llah says this confession of helplessness marks the acme of human development. It represents this high watermark in our spiritual understanding, just coming to that point of realizing that one doesn't know. So what we do have then are a series of maps, a series of approximations, just as in the realm of science, also in the realm of human relationships, in the realm of both individual and collective, which have over history been come together in the structured forms of different world religions. Perhaps these all represent successive approximations of a reality which we will never grasp in its fullness. We looked in a couple of sessions on some consequences of this idea of metaphysical humility, which ultimately takes ideas like God, which have been understood in very concrete terms in the past, and we looked at successive abstractions of the concept of God, from something which exists for sure and has a whole host of proofs to back it up, to something which exists but one can't prove, to something which, well, it exists but we don't know any of its essential qualities, to, well, existence itself is a quality, so maybe we can't even say it exists in the sense that other things exist, to the final step we saw from the writings of the Bab, a statement even to the effect that worshiping God as the object of one's worship becomes itself a form of idolatry. So the whole subject-object distinction becomes dissolved in the face of that reality. So we sort of went in successive abstractions until in the end one is left with an ultimate reality which cannot be named, which cannot even be thought of. Of course, we do name it. Of course, we do think about it. And therein lies the paradox. The paradox that in one and the same time, we acknowledge our helplessness in the face of those great matters of ultimate concern, as Paul Tillich would say. But at the same time, practically in our lives, we still envision it. We still objectify it. We still go about our business as though these things were just as real and tangible as the objects around us. That is part of the, I think, paradox of the human condition. And I'm not certainly in any of my meanderings over the last few months suggesting that one discard one way of looking at it in favor of another way of looking at it. That one reject this one set of theologies or positions in favor of another set. I'm rather suggesting a sort of relative perspective in which different metaphysical possibilities can be simultaneously true. The truth depending on the perspective of the viewer. This is, I think, one of the great points that Baha'u'llah makes in his Seven Valleys, one of his greatest mystical works, where he describes the stages in the progress of the seeker from the stage of seeking the valley of search, as he calls it, through the valley of love, through the valley of unity in the end, in entering this valley of true poverty and absolute nothingness. And Baha'u'llah says that there are certain truths which the spiritual seeker attains at certain valleys, which to seekers in another valley are sheer blasphemy. And the converse likewise holds true, that to the seekers in that other valley, the truths held by the seekers in the valley before are pure impiety. And so, in a very deep sense, those things that we hold to be most true are, in the end, relative to our perspective. So what remains then, if we can't be united by a common dogma, if we can't be united by everyone in this room, everyone on the planet ultimately coming to the same understanding about things, if we let go of that idea that that's ever going to happen, then what we're left with is a different paradigm of unity, in which the unity takes place at the level of action, not at the level of metaphysics. We acknowledge that there will always be different approaches. One of the Muslim mystics said that there are many paths to God as there are breaths of his creatures. Not just the number of creatures, but the number of breaths of the creatures. So it's really multiplied into absolute infinity. So the point of unity then becomes something practical, something in the world, a commitment to justice, a commitment to truthfulness, a commitment to love. We also talked about sorry, I'm taking a little bit too long to summarize things. By the end, I won't have time to add anything more. But the last time we went into Cartesian duality, talked about the nature of spirit, the idea of spirit, and how this is really exemplified by Descartes' dualism, Cartesian dualism, the idea that there are minds and there are bodies, and minds are a different kind of substance than bodies, which leads to certain problems, like, well, how exactly do minds affect bodies? If a mind is an invisible kind of a substance, then at what point does it enter into the body? And Descartes had an interesting theory about that about certain gland in the brain that might form that link between spirit and matter, which we now know is not the case. But the whole idea of Cartesian dualism has been certainly called into question by any philosopher post Descartes, and it's my suggestion that a similar kind of subversion of traditional Cartesian dualism also lies embedded within the Baha'i writings, although one also can find plenty of evidence for a very Cartesian dualistic way of thinking. And this is really in accordance with what Shoghi Effendi has called the spherical nature of the Baha'i revelation. People would write to him and ask, how is it that you can have statements that seem to be contradictory, absolute opposites of each other, all within the same, spoken by the same person? And Shoghi Effendi said, truth is like a sphere. There are poles apart, and in between are the thoughts and ideas that unite them. If truth is really like a sphere, there's really a lot you can unpack from that idea. You can only see one hemisphere at a time. If you try to take the entire sphere and put it out so you can see it all at once, you're going to either have to tear or distort the sphere greatly in several places. Similarly with a cube, a three-dimensional object cast upon a two-dimensional, the shadow of a cube on a sheet of paper, the angles don't look like they're all 90 degrees. Some of them are less than 90 degrees. Some of them are more than 90 degrees. We know that in reality, all the angles of a cube are 90 degrees. But when it's cast into that lower dimensional framework, it seems to take on qualities which actually don't belong to it. Can that also be the case with higher spiritual realities that cast into the limited, let's say, lower dimensional framework of our minds, certain realities seem to be distorted or torn, and that's not a consequence of those realities, but it's a consequence of our own limitations, our own inability to understand them. So I think taking from science this fundamental note of humility, Bertrand Russell, not himself a scientist, but a great philosopher, put it this way. He said, although this may seem a paradox, all exact science is dominated by the idea of approximation. When a man tells you that he knows the exact truth about anything, you are safe in inferring that he is an inexact man. And I think the same thing goes for any sort of claims of a religious nature. Everything we know is by way of approximation. Even Baha'u'llah never said in writing his hundreds of volumes of writings, never said, this is the exact truth. He always said, I'm telling you what is in accordance with the capacity of the age. So, what do we want to say a little bit about this time? Just a few minor topics. The prophet, the word, religion. Maybe I'll only have time for one or two of these. But I wanted to maybe project a little bit what might be the consequences of this way of thinking. I'm not sure I could characterize it in a couple of words, but this relative perspectival way of thinking, this anti-dualistic way of thinking, this fundamentally metaphysically relativistic way of thinking. How might that change the way we look at these traditionally hard categories? The prophet, the word that he reveals, the religion that he founds. Prophets have had different conceptions of themselves. Baha'u'llah famously said this regarding his own self. He said, know verily that whenever this youth turneth his eyes towards his own self, he findeth it the most insignificant of all creation. When he contemplates, however, the bright effulgences he hath been empowered to manifest, lo, that self is transfigured before him into a sovereign potency permeating the essence of all things, visible and invisible. There's a Janus faces of the prophet. There's the human face and the divine face. In some way, we think of the prophet almost like the monolith from the movie 2001. Some of you recognize this immediately. Not all of you might recognize this. One of the most famous scenes in, I would call, movie history. I hope I'm not I don't think I'm exaggerating. I mean, this is an incredible scene. Immediately, you look at that and you think, oh, what a beautiful and subtle and artistic way of describing the role of the prophet. The way people think about the prophet. It's as though it's an alien object thrust into the world. Angular, black, standing upright, something utterly foreign to the experience of those around. And it somehow has this power to inspire, to the story of in the story of 2001, it was the appearance of this monolith which somehow elevated the consciousness of these primates, of these ape-like creatures that were living in its vicinity, suddenly got ideas in their head and suddenly started realizing, oh, I can use these bones to bang on the head of my neighbor, and eventually, throws it up in the air and it turns into this spaceship. That's this amazing scene. But this, I think, encapsulates for me, perhaps with a little bit of an undercurrent of a little bit of a jab or of a poke of the idea of the prophet, which in the eyes of many might as well be this black monolith. It might as well be something that just came straight out of heaven and came down to earth. And whatever it says, whatever it does, is without precedent and has no necessary connection with anything on earth. It's as though it were. Let's see. Let me go forward. It's as though it were Moses carrying the tablets of the Ten Commandments from Mount Sinai. It's that same sort of coming out of nowhere. Moses goes up to the mountain. God reveals to him, thou shalt not do X, Y, and Z. He inscribes it in stone and he brings it down. And that's the idea of revelation. It's ultimately arbitrary. It comes, it's obviously a reflection of a higher truth, but it is arbitrary. In that sense, it's not fundamentally or organically connected to the thing that it's coming down to. This way of looking at revelation can be contrasted to a way that Baha'u'llah himself has described it. He says the prophets of God should be regarded as physicians whose task is to foster the well-being of the world and its peoples, that through the spirit of oneness they may heal the sickness of a divided humanity. Now, the task of a physician is very different from the task of a monolith. The task of the physician is they're in the world. They have knowledge of the nature of the human body. They know what causes sickness and what cures sickness. And what they say and what they do as a physician is informed by the knowledge of the needs of the age. And that's precisely what Baha'u'llah himself says about his own mission. But if that's the case, then what is the role of is the role of the prophet then to tell us things that we didn't know before? This is an interesting question, because you look through what did Moses, let's start with Moses and the Ten Commandments. Thou shalt not kill. Does it take a revelation from God to tell us that we shouldn't kill other people? If Moses had not written that in stone, would human society have never come to that conclusion that it's not good to kill other people? Or is thou shalt not kill ultimately a matter of logic? Is it ultimately a matter that you can understand this, you can get this? You don't need a divine revelation to tell you that this is how you ought to be, or that this is what you oughtn't do. I've been reading the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius lately. He was a Roman emperor, one of the greatest, lived around 180 or so AD. And he writes, as he's battling the Germanic tribes on the northeastern reaches of the empire, he takes some time out and he writes these meditations about life, mortality, what's the purpose of it all? What should I do? He spends a lot of time wondering, does the soul even exist after death? What relationship do the gods have with the world? He's asking all the big questions. And purely on his own, he comes up with the following conclusion about how he should live his life. He says, so where should a man direct his endeavor? And this follows this beautiful meditation on the mortality of man and how every name vanishes in the end, and so what's left in the end. He says, so where should a man direct his endeavor? Here only, a right mind, action for the common good, speech incapable of lies, a disposition to welcome all that happens as necessary, intelligible, flowing from an equally intelligible spring of origin. So let me translate this into terms that are often found in the Baha'i writings. Purity of heart, service, truthfulness, contentment, resignation, acquiescence, radiant acquiescence. Marcus Aurelius seems to have come upon somehow by himself the idea that we should live a life of radiant acquiescence. How did he come upon these deep spiritual truths without a revelation to guide him to it? It's true that he came after Jesus, but I think one would be hard-pressed to argue that he got these ideas from the Christians. These ideas actually can be derived more or less directly from the founder of the Stoic school, Zeno, in 200 or 300 BC, and he represents a sort of a late efflorescence of the Stoic school of Greek philosophy, which is austere but intensely beautiful. What they come upon, the way of life that they propose is so, I think, spiritual and so completely in line with the main, with what the Baha'i faith itself says. In this age we should be occupying ourselves with service to our fellow man, purity of heart. The spiritual and practical prerequisites were all there. So if it's the case that through the exercise of one's own mind, just by thinking about things as they are, one can conclude that one should live one's life pretty much the same as how the prophets and messengers of God have said we should live our lives, then what then is the content that the prophets and manifestations are bringing? If it's not, here's what you should do, oh, we didn't know that, so now we're going to do this. It must be something else. What is the nature of that something else? I want to suggest a part. Baha'u'llah had the image of the doctor as a way to understand the function and role of the prophet, I want to add to this, suggest the image of the musician. This is actually a picture from a very famous experiment that took place about 10 years ago in the Washington, D.C. subway. And here we have a street musician playing to the crowds in the morning rush hour for about an hour, 45 minutes to an hour. About 1,000 people walked by while he was playing his set. A few people threw a few dollars in the violin case at his feet. A couple people threw, I think, total of 7 stopped at some point to listen to the music. We know all of this because there were reporters stationed at all of the entrances and exits to the subway station, and they were counting the number of people coming and going. They were observing very closely what was going on, because these reporters knew what the morning commuters didn't know, that this is Joshua Bell, a famous solo violinist, one of the most lauded performers today. He's playing a golden era Stradivarius violin worth how many millions of dollars, and he's playing some of the most difficult and transcendent items in the violin repertoire. And this was done as an experiment. How many people are going to stop and listen? How many people are going to recognize true greatness when it comes face to face with them in the Washington, D.C.? If I said New York, it's the Washington, D.C. subway. And the answer was quite quantifiable. 7 people out of 1,000 will hear the music. And they went and they asked these people afterwards, they as they left the subway station, each one of them was met by a reporter who said very innocuously, "Can we call you later this evening, ask you a few questions about your morning commute?" So they got their phone number, and then they let a few hours go by. At the end of the day, they called each of those 7 people and said, "So tell us about your morning commute," wanting to see how many would say without prompting that they had this amazing experience in the morning, that this transcendent music just sort of hit them and washed over them like a river. 2 people maybe said that. The others just stopped, and they didn't even think about it until the reporter said, "Well, what about, did you hear any, was there a musician or something?" They said, "Oh, yeah, I listened to this guy play some violin." So discount 5 of the 7, and you're left with about 2. One of them recognized Joshua Bell, so she doesn't count because she saw him in concert, the last week. So you're down to 1 person who really got it, who was not expecting it, who recognized something really great and something really transcendent in a context which was unexpected. Is the prophet a little bit like this? They're playing the most transcendent music, the most life-altering music. They're playing it in a way, perhaps in a style we haven't heard before. They're certainly playing it in a place we don't expect to find prophets. They're not playing it at the pulpit of a church or a mosque. They're not surrounded by adoring crowds who are asking them questions about the deeper meanings of life. They're there on the street corner, playing their music. And in every age, only a few ears are there to hear. And perhaps this also explains a little bit, what is that content? If it's the case that someone like a Marcus Aurelius can write out so much of the content of the moral and ethical life without it being revealed to him. Nevertheless, there's something austere. Not austere can be used in a good or a bad sense. There's something, let's say, emotionally cold about it. People don't read Marcus Aurelius and say, I'm gonna devote my life to this and give up all my possessions and move to another country and undertake all manner of hardships. That's not what it does. The most transcendent and penetrating philosophies, all the way to Socrates and Plato. Socrates himself was, 5 or 6 sigma out there. I mean, he actually had a chance to give his life for it. But that's one case out of how many? By and large, philosophy doesn't have that power to move people. It has you can argue the content, but it doesn't have the power. It doesn't have the music. And it's the music that the prophet brings, which ultimately differentiates it from just another set of great ideas that you might or might want to follow. So here's another picture of Joshua Bell off to the left there. How are we doing on time? Because I don't want to go too far over. I may have a lot more to talk about, but I don't. We started a few minutes. I'll go a few minutes more. Connected to this is, I think, a fundamentally different way of looking at the phenomenon of religion. Just as we're proposing that the reality of a prophet is different from that, the Charlton Heston kind of bearded man with the inscribed tablets. If we think of it more in less stark terms, that this is something that comes out of the sky and lands like a spaceship. If we think of it as something more organic, as something which evolves with the evolving consciousness of the human race, then we also might think about the nature of religious systems in different ways. But Abdu'l-Baha had the following truly, I think, revolutionary way of putting it, which takes the idea of the prophet, their words, and religion together, and it gives us a completely different way of looking at it. This comes from some answered questions. He says, briefly, the supreme manifestations of God are aware of the reality of the mysteries of beings. Therefore, they establish laws which are suitable and adapted to the state of the world of man. For religion is the essential connection which proceeds from the realities of things. And a little bit later, he repeats himself. He says, religion then is the necessary connection which emanates from the reality of things. And as the supreme manifestations of God are aware of the mysteries of beings, therefore they understand this essential connection, and by this knowledge establish the law of God. Very different picture than the angel whispered in their ear. Why are they saying it? Well, they received a revelation and they're just repeating it to us. These words were spoken to them and they're just repeating the words that they heard. This way of looking at it is far more deeply interfused with the realities of things. This way of looking at it sees revelation as, in the end, a natural phenomenon. Natural in the sense that the appearance of the fruit on the tree is a natural phenomenon. Although without a knowledge of the tree beforehand, you would never guess that something like the fruit would appear. If you'd never seen an apple tree before and you plant an apple tree and it's growing and you think you understand what it's about, it's putting forth leaves, branches, and buds and so forth, and then suddenly it puts out flowers, and then these flowers turn into fruits. I mean, it's a miracle, when you really think about how this happens. The way that the fruit appears is in a way that is entirely unexpected, given sort of the sequence of events that you were able to observe up until then. But nevertheless, the appearance of the fruit is a perfectly natural and indeed inevitable phase in the development of the tree. Could it be a similar sort of a thing with these great individuals that we call prophets? Rather than coming from outer space, so to speak, they appear in the appointed age. Who appoints that age? The appointed age is the age of maturity. It's the season of the harvest, when the fruit appears. When the times are ripe, the fruit appears. That fruit being a prophet in any given age. What do they know? How do they know it? They have an innate understanding of the connections between things. How can we understand that in non-magical terms? Well, how is it that someone like Mozart can come along and at the age of 6 or 7 start writing full pieces of beautiful music? How is it that a Shakespeare could write the plays that he wrote, or the great artists and people who are absolute prodigies in their craft show an understanding of, an ability to go places where no one else can go? We don't say that's magic. We don't say, well, Mozart was some sort of magician, although we would also say no one could do what Mozart could do. He was born with it. He came from a musical family, so he had a leg up. There's no doubt about that. But it takes more than just coming from a musical family to produce what he produced. There's something not supernatural, but preternatural about it. There's something so utterly out of the ordinary. Can it be that we can understand this phenomenon of prophethood in similar terms? And is that consistent with this redefinition of religion that Abdu'l-Baha gives? It's interesting, actually, how he defines, or rather redefines, religion as consisting in essential relationships. Elsewhere, and just reiterating what he said in the last slide in that first line, religion then is the necessary connection which emanates from the realities of things. If we're looking at how religion is redefined by this, we can't leave out other statements that Abdu'l-Baha makes. For instance, regarding nature, he says, by nature is meant those inherent properties and necessary relations derived from the realities of things. Going to the original Persian, he's using exactly the same Persian words to describe religion and nature. That's pretty amazing. Typically, up until a couple of centuries ago, people opposed religion and nature. They were entirely separate, irreconcilable categories. Religion is the supernatural by definition, and nature is nature. Abdu'l-Baha here is taking religion and he's putting it in the same category as nature. This is also what Baha'u'llah does when he says the will of God and nature are the same thing. What people have taken to be this operation of the divine in the world, Baha'u'llah also says that's what the philosophers have called nature. What comes from this, though? What comes from this collapse of the categories? Collapse of the category of the supernatural and the natural into one thing. Just as we were talking about the collapse of the category of the spiritual and the physical into something which, in which the spiritual and physical still are meaningful terms, but they no longer have that sort of absolute metaphysical import that they had before. They have something which is now more of a relative import. Further on this deconstruction of the idea of religion, Abdu'l-Baha, on the definition of love, defines it also in very similar terms, this a bit more obscured by translation. He says, love is the cause of God's revelation unto man, the vital bond inherent in accordance with the divine creation in the realities of things. And here, many of the words in Persian are the same as those which he uses to define religion. Elsewhere, he talks about the laws which ought to govern society, the laws of a just society. How does he describe what those are and where they come from? This is from a treatise he wrote on politics, which has not yet been published and made generally available. But this is how he puts it. He said, these rules and relationships that constitute the basis of human happiness and that attend the descent of the divine favors are none other than the divine law and the social order that ensure the felicity, the integrity, and the security of the human race. This law and order consist in the necessary relationships deriving from the realities of things. How could they otherwise bring order to the body politic or be conducive to the well-being and happiness of human society? Unobjectionable taken on its own, he's saying the laws that we govern ourselves by have to make sense. They have to proceed from reality. They can't just be arbitrary. But put alongside these other definitions of religion, of nature, of love, Abdu'l-Baha is using the same phrase to describe all of these realities. Something, I think, very subtle and something very profound is at work here. And I think we're being invited to a fundamentally different way of looking at some very fundamental categories, such that that our whole way of looking at religion can be transformed by this. It comes out of its shell, out of thinking of it as competing communities fighting for followers, sometimes fighting for real, and it transcends itself. The notion of religion becomes something which is more a function of our collective social evolution rather than a set of dogmas or a set of warring faith communities. As stated by the House of Justice a few years ago, it says, Baha'u'llah has not brought into existence a new religion to stand beside the present multiplicity of sectarian organizations. Rather has he recast the whole conception of religion as the principal force impelling the development of consciousness. This is, I think, a major contribution to a new narrative for understanding the relationship, not just between religion and science, but between one religion and the next. So that's probably a good point to stop. Thanks for listening this far. And if there's any time, then I'm happy to take questions, or we can have a little conversation about it. So, thank you. Sorry?
15 minutes for questions?
Sure, yeah. Yes?
If, like you were saying, the prophet is just a conduit, they were given the revelation, they just passed it along, there's fallibility in man. How do we know that they got it right? How do we know that when people, like for instance with Christianity, they went off the tracks with that one during the Crusades and all that sort of stuff, way away from what the actual message is.
Right.
As
Yeah.
I see it is.
Well, first of all, they're not necessarily a conduit. But however you envision what they are, it's absolutely the case that what people have done with it historically has been to twist it into all sorts of configurations which are not in accordance with their original intention or spirit. I don't think I'm saying anything out of sort of, controversial in saying that.
Curious, how would you tell whether the actual prophet was in line with what God actually intended or not,
How do you know if the prophet was in line? Well, how do you know that Beethoven, when he was writing, his Symphony No. 9, was in line with the highest principles of music composition? Well, you listen to it. Does the music move you? Is it beautiful? Ultimately, that's it. Because you don't have access to the metaphysical realm, right? You don't have access to the Platonic form of the music to sort of line up the notes that Beethoven wrote and say, well, this was the wrong note there and that was the right note there. And you can't do that with what the prophets are doing either. You have to judge them not based on some metaphysical criteria that no one has objective access to. You can only judge them on the basis of their fruits. By their fruits shall ye know them, which is just what Jesus said in the Bible. And I don't think that's ever going to change, because we're never going to have access to the reality that they claim to have access to. All we can say is, are they playing beautiful music? Is what the prophet is saying transformative? Is there a fire in their words that compels people to follow it? That's not the case with Marcus Aurelius. However gorgeous his writing is, and however incredibly deep and profound, and despite the fact that he comes to all the same conclusions, it leaves you cold in the end. But you read the Sermon on the Mount, and there's something in there. There's a fire in it, and which is closest to poetry, I suppose. You can say, well, that doesn't mean it comes from God. You've got the sonnets of Shakespeare and the great poems of Wordsworth and Shelley and others, and these also move us profoundly. But do they move us in the sense that, do people say, well, I'm going to give up all the comforts of my life and follow this philosophy? No one even does that with the poets. Somehow it's only the prophets that people do this with. And if that's maybe that's a poor definition of what it is that differentiates. But because we can't come up with a metaphysical definition of the differentiating factor that everyone can agree on, I think we can all agree that in the realm of action, what they say and what they do has results far in excess of what we would expect if they were simply philosophers, if they're simply people coming with a great idea. And it's that element which we look to in judging whether it's true or not. Yeah, Maxime?
I'm wondering, how do you distinguish a prophet from a pure intellectual? I was wondering if you were suggesting that it's only the ability to be heard from masses.
The ability what? To
be heard.
To be heard by the masses.
By the masses. I guess a follow-up
Yeah.
would be about the idea of revelation. I'm not quite sure I got the conclusion from the example with Marcus Aurelius. So
Yeah.
I was wondering if you were personally thinking that, I guess, I was not sure what meaning you were giving to the word revelation in terms of, is that a revelation in the traditional sense of something being revealed to you, or is it just...
Yeah, Aurelius is not claiming that, God spoke these words to me. He's not claiming any kind of divine authority for those words. He never even intended to publish it. As far as we know, his meditations were entirely meant for himself. And those around him, after his death, pulled them together and published them. And then they've sort of had their existence as a book ever since. But he never claimed that there was any special origin to those words. And what strikes me so much about it, though, is that he concludes so much along the lines of what say Baha'u'llah and Abdu'l-Baha say are what we ought to do in the world today. Have a pure heart, speak with truthfulness, be of service to our fellow men. Live in contentment and resignation, to the will of God. Marcus Aurelius put it in different terms. He said, nature and the universe, but it's the same idea. But nevertheless, it's not the same. And what makes it different? And that's the thing. And that, I think, goes to the first part of your question. What is the difference between these two? And you can't, I don't think, intellectually say what it is. You can only say, based upon the fact that there are, 1 billion or 2 people following the words of Jesus, and no one except a few people taking philosophy courses who have even heard of Marcus Aurelius today. I mean, as great as he was in the material domain as well as being a great leader, but also a powerful philosopher. What differentiates? And it's that the X factor, that makes a prophet somehow. And maybe it's connected to what you're saying. They have a mission to lift humanity as a whole. And so they're not speaking just to the philosophical, caste. They're not speaking at a high intellectual level. They're speaking in a way that everyone can understand and everyone can be moved by, because their mission is ultimately not just to move a few philosophers. Their mission is ultimately to lift up the state of humanity, to bring things to the next state of consciousness, as this beautiful statement that we concluded with says. This power of religion, which is this principal force impelling the development of consciousness. Ultimately, that's what it does. And it does it not just to a small coterie of specialized individuals, but it does it for everyone. And so it appeals universally. Yeah.
So do you believe that is a quality in every human being to kind of be able to feel something when they see a prophet versus an intellectual? Because this is something that I've seen a lot in just community service type of world, where a lot of the organizations and communities that really have been around a long time and make a lot of impact happen to be religious organizations. But I know everyone would agree to say that, of course, community service is good, and of course I should devote my time to it, but just the data shows something else. And so I always wonder, what is your opinion on kind of what is the innate capacity or drive of some human beings to adapt a particular religion, kind of have that dictate versus their own personal reflections, not necessarily translated to action, but like you said, on paper, they're saying the same thing.
Yeah. I understand the Baha'i writings to say that it's almost a definition of our humanity. What differentiates us from the animals, I mean, apart from the quantitative distinction that we're that much more intelligent or that much more whatever, but the qualitative distinction has to do with the fact that all human beings have this potential to be set alight, have the potential to be transformed. And that moment of transformation, which is ultimately mystical. I mean, there's no way to scientifically get at this. Again, all you can do is point to it. And it's not that common either. But it happens. And somehow that process of transformation, of being utterly changed by something when you hear it, being, and this the nearest, I think, analog to that is music. People, and a lot of people who've never experienced this in the realm of religion have experienced this in the realm of music, have heard something that just goes straight to their soul, and in a few notes can move them to tears or bring them up to the highest states of joy and exaltation. What is it in just a few vibrations of air that can do that? So in the purely sort of physical world, we have that as a model for understanding how is this possible in the realm of religion. How is it that a few words spoken by someone, 180, 160 years ago, 2,000 years ago, 4,000 years ago, how is it that these words still have power? And what explains that power? And we all have the potential to be moved by it, although in reality few of us are. But that's the other paradox of the human condition. We're all sheep in a sense. Baha'u'llah says in one of his most, I don't know, it sounds harsh, cynical, but at the same time truth-telling statements in his Book of Laws. He says, regard mankind as a flock of sheep who need a shepherd for their protection. He's saying this in the modern age. We might have said, 2,000 years ago that makes sense, but now that the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution, we all have perfect moral autonomy now. Baha'u'llah is saying that's not the case. Won't be the case for any time soon. That's almost a feature of the human condition as well. But that's not what he's calling us to. He's not calling us to be sheep. He's saying that's how the majority of mankind, the majority of humanity is that way. But we're all called to something higher. We're called to this transformative event that somehow they uniquely mediate through their words. So, is that 15 minutes?
I think we have time for
one more question.
Okay. Not sure, short, but
yeah.
So, and correct me if what I'm assuming in this question is incorrect, but it seems to me like when we started our recap, we said there's this crisis of spirituality in our modern age, and thus you've highlighted some of the things in which, some of the ways in which science has influenced our reconceptualization of religion. And I'm wondering, having arrived at this reconceptualization of religion, how does that now feed back into science? And what does that, or especially in terms of those who would insist that there is an inherent contradiction between them?
Yes.
Because it seems like we've focused the consultation on the first part, and I'm wondering what kind of things are feeding back.
I think it feeds back very directly and in my mind very naturally, because it undercuts what I think of as the fundamental point of tension, and that is this clash of opinions about what it is that causes things. A scientific approach would say, that you can only model what you can directly observe. And you're only going to build scientific theories on the basis of what can be objectively observed. And what has happened, and this clashes with a traditional theological viewpoint, which is that there are spiritual forces which directly cause things to happen. Spiritual, which is just, if you took out the word spiritual and put in the word magic, it's the same thing. Right. In other words, it's combating a magical view that the causes of things ultimately are invisible, and the way that I think these ideas can help resolve that fundamental tension is by undercutting the dualistic way that we have thought about spirit and matter. We're taking the idea of spirit out of the realm of some kind of invisible substance that acts on matter, just like matter does, but it's invisible. And we're forcing ourselves to think in more subtle terms about what we mean when we say that there's a spiritual cause behind it. when someone asked Baha'u'llah about this, his answer was that nature and the will of God are the same thing. Abdu'l-Baha, commenting, and this is in Baha'u'llah's Tablet of Wisdom, Abdu'l-Baha wrote a commentary on the Tablet of Wisdom where he clarifies even further. He says, whatever it is that the theologians have called God's will is the same thing as the scientists have called nature. He's taken those two categories and collapsed them. And the collapse of those two categories, I think, is not to say, okay, spirit doesn't exist anymore. It's not to say, okay, we're all materialists now. It's not that the spiritual has been collapsed onto the material, and it's not that the material has been collapsed onto the spiritual. So we're not talking about a metaphysical monism of either the materialistic type or of, say, the idealistic type of a Berkeley or someone like that. We're talking about something which is more of, I think, a perspectival monism. This phrase I don't think exists yet, but I think it's implied by something Abdu'l-Baha said, and which I quoted last time or the time before, which I think is the key to all of this. And he says, to the vegetable, the animal is the spiritual reality. So if that's the way you think about spirit and matter, then what we define as spirit then becomes not a different category of substance with all the attendant philosophical problems attached to that, because then you have to explain, well, how does substance interact with matter? And then you have miracles and all other things that come out of that. But rather, you're thinking about spirit as a matter of of which direction you're facing along the circle of ascent. I'm going back to this Ouroboros, the snake swallowing its tail, which is conveniently the symbol of this fine room. Abdu'l-Baha recapitulates this idea of the circle of existence in many places in his tablets and talks. He defines existence as an emanative arc and a returning arc. And along this arc are the different degrees of existence, from the mineral kingdom to the vegetable to the animal kingdom and so forth. However much modern science has taken away the sharp distinctions between these levels, there still remains a sense of there being an ascending scale of consciousness. From that perspective, what we define as spirit could be thought of as the thing that is above us, the thing that is beyond us on the ladder of evolution, and what is material is that which is behind us. So it's suggesting a different way of thinking about an age-old distinction, which now no longer has any necessary tension with the scientific method and with what you do in a laboratory as a scientist. You're no longer battling between visible and invisible causes, and fighting with this other group that says, well, all of these things that you're examining in the laboratory really have spiritual causes behind it, and you're misidentifying the causes. It takes that argument out, which I think is the fundamental sort of brick in this whole wall between science and religion. So I think this is all we have time for. So thanks again for your patience and for coming along. And
I think Stephen did a pretty good job of whetting some of your appetites, I could tell, for more of this kind of content. I just wanted to give a notice that there's this lecture series is a shortened version of a much longer series that's available online, 20 hours on the same material, and it goes into much more depth. So if you're curious, it's on SoundCloud, which is like the YouTube just for audio. And if you search for Science, Religion, New Narrative, you'll find the 40 file playlist of his 20-hour lecture.
So thank you. Yeah. So I don't have internet here, but this is that's the link for it up there. Thanks again.